Head of the Kurdish Working Group for Human Rights in South Africa, Mahmoud Patel. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Erem. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, what is the purpose of the campaign that you started from South Africa? What is the importance of the campaign? And could you please give us some information about the letter that been sent to UN General Secretary as well?
Okay. The purpose of the campaign is firstly, the time has come for the freedom of Abdullah Ocalan towards a just peace in Turkey. It was a joint effort with the Congress of Trade Unions in South Africa, COSATU, the largest trade union in South Africa, ourselves as the Kurdish Human Rights Action Group in South Africa. Our key objective is to promote a just peace in Turkey and the region, because President Erdogan's regime has in the last few years pursued an internal and external policy of expansion and aggression. And for us, the key individual who can bring peace to Turkey is Abdullah Ocalan. Therefore, it is absolutely essential that his freedom as the legitimate representative of the Kurdish people is essential in paving the way for peace in Turkey and the region. We know from our own experience in South Africa that the release of a legitimate and credible leadership is inevitable and necessary precondition for any peace process.
The South African prosecuted people through ANC and PAC, and the Kurdish people through PKK embarked on the armed struggle for liberation. Uh, what is the similarities between Mandela and Öcalan?
Okay, for us, what is key and what is important is when the armed struggle was declared in South Africa, like in Turkey with the PKK, it didn't happen at the very beginning of the struggle. It after repeated oppression by the powers who were oppressing in South Africa, the apartheid government, in Turkey, the Turkish state. Then, after many decades, the armed struggle was declared in South Africa. The ANC, its military wing was MK, Umkhonto weSizwe, and the PAC was POCO and APLA. And it was for the legitimate aspirations and self-determination as entrenched in international law for the right for people to self-determination. Very similar to the PKK that embarked on an armed struggle for the liberation of the peoples. Nelson Mandela had undergone underground training to lead the armed struggle after Sharpeville in 1960 when the apartheid government killed innocent people in Sharpeville. He was also betrayed by the American Secret Services, who informed the apartheid state where he was, and that led to his arrest. While Abdullah Ocalan was betrayed by the Secret Services as well of the United States, Britain, and Israel, and then handed over to MIT or Turkish intelligence in Kenya when he was en route to South Africa. Remember, in 1999, President Mandela's cabinet and our previous chairperson of the Kurdish Human Rights Action Group, Judge Essa Musa, they secured to give Abdullah Ocalan political asylum if he came to South Africa. So there is that connection between us, Abdullah Ocalan, the PKK, and the Kurdish people for their legitimate struggle for self-determination and their freedom.
KHRAG started that campaign with COSATU with a letter. You are asking for the same rules to be applied to Öcalan with Mandela. What are these rules? What are you exactly asking for in that letter?
What we want, even before Abdullah Ocalan must be released, as he is there currently. Remember, he occupies a prison cell. For many years, he was the only and sole inmate on the Imrali Island prison with 4,000 soldiers. The CPT released a report recently, and in that report, it also identified that his prison conditions are horrible, and they are in the extreme where a political prisoner cannot be allowed to be in those conditions. The Mandela rules that were adopted by the United Nations have a long history as to how it was finally adopted in its present form. But essentially, it is to ensure that political prisoners are not unduly discriminated. They have a right to visitation. They have a right for normal engagement with others. For example, if they want to read something, access to literature, books, whatever. We know Abdullah Ocalan has been denied most of those things for a number of years in his over 2 decade incarceration. So the CPT, by speaking to the UN Mandela rules. Remember, it's called the Mandela rules because it was primarily when the international campaign for the Free Mandela started to gain momentum, and Nelson Mandela's incarceration on Robben Island went onto the world stage with international mobilization, with campaigns by comrades and solidarity partners in the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world. So similarly, we want to see those rules of which clearly state how political prisoners must be treated. Besides, we know for many years he was even denied access by his legal representatives, which is a gross violation for a political prisoner in terms of the UN Mandela rules, as well as the cutoff from family for a number of years. Those are rights that must be upheld for the political prisoners. And the CPT has very clearly put that. Therefore, you will see in our letter campaign that we've invited others to join in this international campaign. We have clearly stated the violations that have taken place there and what was the reference made to it with regards to Imrali Island F type prison security that Abdullah Ocalan has been, together with the inhumane prison conditions that contravene relevant international human rights and standards, including Turkey's law.
You also have called for the UN countries about the campaign. What they can do realistically for this campaign? Very short, very briefly.
Look, the United Nations, firstly, we must understand, was established to maintain peace and security, to develop friendly relations amongst nations. Turkey was one of the founder members of the United Nations. It is the only international non state body globally that has reached through all governments as well as to all areas where there is conflict uh, in the globe and on different continents. In particular, here we're focusing on the issue of Abdullah Ocalan. We believe that this regard for the fundamental human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and related international treaties is a major source of ongoing armed conflicts, and the involvement of the UN with the member states. And we have got good news with President Biden's inauguration. He has signed an executive order where he has strengthened the United States membership of the UN. So the lobbying in the United Nations through the Secretary General and the pressure of the solidarity partners to the UN Secretary General must make and bring the issue squarely on the table for the United Nations so that they then may put pressure on the domestic countries, on Turkey as well, through the mechanisms of the United Nations, through dialogue, diplomacy, to get a political resolution. The sooner, the better.
What is the campaign's next step? What is the realistic planning for the campaign?
Firstly, to get as many solidarity partners, not only South Africa and Africa, but elsewhere in Europe, North America. Many of them have already sent through their support, but we'd like more organizations, even political parties, progressive ones in Europe, North America, United Kingdom, South Africa, and Africa to support this campaign. It is only through that constant pressure that we will get a response. The important thing is that is one step. Subsequent to this, we will continue with our other solidarity partners with other campaigns as well. Remember, protests are important, but in the COVID pandemic, we cannot have a lot of that. So, webinars, constantly inviting all our solidarity partners, that would ensure that the momentum from the international campaign continues and remains in the consciousness of not only human rights organizations, but in the mainstream as well, with regards to the issue of Abdullah Ocalan's incarceration and the urgency for his release.
How did the UN become a supporter of freedom for Mandela, and what UN can do for Öcalan?
Well, the history with the United Nations and apartheid and so on started firstly in 1946. And the National Party only came into power in 1948. After that, it continued with renewed appeals to the United Nations because of the international mobilization of those who were committed against apartheid and discrimination and racism in South Africa. But after 1960 and Sharpeville, then the United Nations issued a Security Council Resolution 134 deploring South Africa's conduct against its own citizens. Thereafter, the continuous lobbying internationally brought many other resolutions as well to the table that brought about the mainstream thinking, not only in the United Nations, but internationally as well, to put pressure on apartheid South Africa. So the way in which it was brought to the United Nations was because of the constant lobbying of the ANC, the Pan-Africanists, and other, the Communist Party of South Africa, the South African Communist Party, as well as other forces in South Africa who were in exile, together with lobbying in the United Kingdom, North America, Europe, South America, Cuba, and other liberatory movements on the continent. Those partnerships and the international solidarity was what bore fruit and result for the UN putting apartheid squarely on the agenda for the United Nations.
Mandela and Öcalan were charged with treason and sentenced to life imprisonment. And both were imprisoned on islands. Mandela in Robben Island and Öcalan in Imrali. In one interview that published a day ago, you have mentioned that Öcalan's situation is worse than Mandela. Could you please tell us a bit more about why Öcalan is in worse situation?
Simply, you look at his prison conditions, like I mentioned earlier. He lives in a cell that's about 13 meters square. He was denied visitation by his legal representatives, by international organizations, 3 Imrali delegations. Our previous chair, Judge Esa Musa, led 2 delegations as well as continuous requests to have access to Abdullah Ocalan. It was denied. Nelson Mandela, while he was incarcerated, was allowed those kinds of visitations by legal, of which Judge Esa Musa was Mandela's lawyer. So when I spoke about it, I'm speaking about it with our experiences connected with our struggle here with Nelson Mandela and the movement against apartheid and what is happening currently with Abdullah Ocalan. The CPT report gives it in much more detail, as well as our comrades, as well as friends and others who have been there to see exactly what his conditions were. Remember, between 2011 and 2019, even the lawyers were denied visitation. Families were not allowed. He is only allowed a phone call with her brother. So his conditions as a prisoner are so restricting that it is mental torture. That kind of torture should not be allowed to continue with Abdullah Ocalan. Therefore, I'm saying it is worse, and we have said it is worse than Nelson Mandela's incarceration. Mandela also had the opportunity to interact with other prisoners, which Abdullah Ocalan doesn't have. Can you imagine to be for many years the sole inmate on the island of Imrali with 4,000 soldiers? How much do they fear somebody who wants peace and has asked for peace on so many occasions? Yet the Turkish state does not respond in same kind gestures. In South Africa, we refused to negotiate until our leader was released. Yet Ocalan asks for it while he's behind bars. Therefore, I am saying, and others have said, including our previous chair of KHRAG, that this is much more inhumane than the conditions of Nelson Mandela.
What is your comments on the system of strict isolation implemented by the Turkish authorities in Imrali? Do you think lack of pressure by UN and EU encourages Turkey to continue that violations? Please, very short, very briefly.
Erem, simply put, the failure of the international community, the United Nations, the European Union, and other organizations, including NATO, of which Turkey is a member, have failed morally, legally, and politically through diplomacy as well as other means to pressurize the state, the Turkish state, with regards to the treatment meted out to Abdullah Ocalan in terms of his isolation, in terms of the lack of access to legal representation, his family visitation, more than the time they give him outside and so on. It is precisely because of the failure of the international community, the member states of the European Union, and others that can make the right pressure on them to bring about. Therefore, this campaign wants the United Nations to take cognizance of this and to put this on the table so that there can be pressure on the Turkish state for the conditions that are inhumane and go against international law and instruments as well.
It has already been more than 20 years that KHRAG is established, as I know. Why and how it was established? Can you give us some more information about KHRAG? Very short, very briefly.
Okay, it's much more detailed, but I'll just go to the crux of issues. KHRAG stands for Kurdish Human Rights Action Group, South Africa. Remember earlier I explained or I mentioned that to the cabinet of Nelson Mandela and our first chair of KHRAG, or Kurdish Human Rights Action Group, KHRAG, Justice Essa Musa, there was permission to welcome Abdullah Ocalan because he was not, he was going to be captured or he was not allowed asylum in any countries, whether Russia, Greece, Italy, and all the countries basically kicked him out. So in principle, it was agreed that should he find his way to South African or Namibian soil, he'll be given political asylum in South Africa. But then we know what happened. He was captured and so on, handed over to Turkey, and he went. But while that was happening, this committee that was going to be part of the welcoming committee of Abdullah Ocalan included Judge Essa Musa, Professor Kara Asmal, included our Minister of Justice at the time in the democracy, Jalal Umar, many others, Imam Hassan Solomons, other activists as well were part of this welcoming group and the Kurdish Human Rights Action Group. Once news was received that he had been captured, Abdullah Ocalan had been captured and handed over to Turkish authorities, that welcoming group then became known as the Kurdish Human Rights Action Group, and till today is a human rights organization doing work for lobbying as well as human rights work for Kurdish people in Turkey in particular, as well as in Syria, Iraq, and in Iran, and the human rights that are going on there. So we monitor, we lobby, we conscientize, we do as much as we can through this organization in South Africa and with our solidarity partners as well. So that is the basic history of how the Kurdish Human Rights Action Group started in South Africa. The work started a little earlier than 1999, when a first delegation of the PKK met with South African stalwarts from our liberation struggle, which included Judge Essa Musa. And that then became this group, which was now lobbying government, and then it became the Kurdish Human Rights Action Group once the news was given that Abdullah Ocalan had been captured. And then the decision was made that this organization will continue working for the freedom and solidarity for Kurdish human rights until their freedom comes.
Head of Kurdish Working Group for Human Rights in South Africa, Mahmoud Patel. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for your comments today.
Thank you very much, Erem, and thank you to all your viewers and listeners as well.
Thank you.